Foreword, by Alicia Garza. All good books are alike in that they are truer than if they had really happened, and after you're finished reading one you will feel that all that happened to you and afterwards it all belongs to you. The good and the bad, the ecstasy, the remorse and sorrow, the people and the places and how the weather was. Ernest Hemingway. My first reading of Revolution in the Air left me profoundly confused. As a young organizer, I read this book as if each page should contain a ready-made solution to the challenges I was grappling with. How could we build a million-strong movement when our organization and those we work closely with only engaged hundreds? Could anything be done to close the gap between paid staff organizers and the membership of organizations, who were largely working-class people of color? What was needed to contribute to a mass movement for safety and justice while winning concrete gains for our communities? What happened to the radical groups that I'd heard so much about? How would we know if revolution was in fact around the corner? Of course, this approach was misguided, but certainly fit the stage of development that I was in. I hadn't yet spent enough time building the movement to understand its nuances. I hadn't yet studied much of the origins of the Marxist-Leninist tradition that I was loosely trained in. I made it all the way through the first part and then skimmed the rest. I'll come back to it, I said to myself. Coming back to this book after nearly 20 years of organizing and building a movement, and just weeks after Donald Trump was declared the winner of the contest with Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, the words within could not have been more important. Whereas Hemingway said, they could not be truer than if they happened to me. As I came back to the book for the second time, there was so much texture, so many contours. There were times I'd put the book on the table and just stare into space. How had I missed these valuable stories? How might my work have been different if only I'd come back to Max Elbaum a little bit sooner? The truth is, as Max tells us, it's through the experience of making mistakes, of taking risks and having our efforts fail, that we can assess with clear eyes what went wrong, what went right, what the opposition is up to, and what to do or not to do the next time one is presented with an opportunity. Hindsight may be 20/20, but in this case, the hindsight offered in this book is critical to advancing the legacy that Max and so many others have fought for. This hindsight contains the lessons that I so desperately searched for when I first picked up this book. Perhaps it was divine intervention that Max asked me to pen a new foreword for the book, just 2 months before the election. The consequences of the lessons offered here are clearer to me now than they were when I picked up this book years ago, particularly those lessons that highlight the tension between becoming the left wing of the possible versus the proposition that a key task of the left is to expand the boundaries of what is considered possible. Throughout my early organizing, I would listen as Max and others warned us about the dangers of sectarianism. The consequence of being dogmatic around a political line was the halted potential of building mass bases that could contend for power on the basis of a political program. Max writes, without a large, active and any capitalist social base to draw strength from, interact with, and be held accountable to, left organizations face profound dilemmas. Pressures to surrender revolutionary politics in order to make an immediate impact on public policy are immense. On the other hand, groups determined to resist the rightward pull find that even survival, much less growth, is no easy task. Temptations to retreat into a small but secure niche on the margins of politics and or confine oneself to revolutionary propaganda are extremely great. So is the impulse to rely on purer-than-thou fidelity to old orthodox ease to maintain membership morale, ensure organizational cohesion, and compete with other groups. As Marx himself put it, when the working class is not yet ripe for an independent historical movement, it will be a period of socialist sectarianism. For example, Revolution in the Air posits that much of the left is ambivalent at our own peril about elections and electoral organizing, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary that elections do in fact matter. Despite celebrating the political orientation of leaders like the late Fidel Castro or the late Hugo Chavez, the left acts as if millions of people don't use elections as a vehicle to express the future that they want to see, and ridicules the idea that power is partially expressed through decision-making, and short a strategy of armed struggle, have little to no chance of taking power in the United States without somehow engaging in electoral organizing strategies. The election of Donald Trump on November 8, 2016, was a bittersweet reminder of this dynamic and its consequences. During the election, the left missed several important opportunities. One was an opportunity to extend the conversation curated by movements like Occupy Wall Street to highlight the dangers of capitalism. Another was the opportunity offered by candidates like Bernie Sanders to further expand the conversation about socialism. Yet another was to resist the narrowing of our vision into specific issues, rather than broadening to a larger program of freedom and democracy for all. Still another was the opportunity to resist co-opting the language of liberals who bemoan identity politics to destabilize forces behind the important demands to dismantle structural inequality and racism. The radical left adopted three basic positions with respect to the most recent election. One position was that the election represented a contest between two sides of the same coin, that there was no fundamental difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and thus, engaging in the election would demonstrate an adherence to the corrupt two-party system, thereby constituting an act of treason against left principles, politics, and values. Another position was that Hillary Clinton was simply too corrupt to vote for. As such, they would sit out the election or vote for a third party, such as the Green Party or Libertarian Party. The third position was somewhere in between, that the primary task was to defeat Donald Trump and the GOP's hateful agenda, or that Hillary Clinton, while not perfect, represented the best of what was possible under neoliberalism, and that a vote for her was a vote in favor of women's equality. My estimation of things is that most of the left was somewhere between the first two positions, believing that both parties and or candidates were irreparably corrupt, and therefore that it was a betrayal of the left to engage in any manner other than critique. At the time of the election, I had spent the previous 3 years building Black Lives Matter BLM, an international network with more than 40 chapters across North America and the United Kingdom. I dreaded the election more than most, primarily because Hillary Clinton had announced her candidacy and I knew we were in for an uphill battle. I was concerned that Clinton would dog-whistle her way to the White House, as her husband had done in the 1990s. I was mildly annoyed that candidate Bernie Sanders couldn't get it together to address with any real substance criminalization, police violence, and other forms of state violence that by that time had taken center stage. Black Lives Matter had become a household name, and yet no candidate would substantively address the issues we were concerned with. I focused solely on the Democratic Party, as candidate Donald Trump did not seem capable of winning. My distaste for the Clintons goes back to the 1990s. When then-President Bill Clinton was dubbed the first black president for having an extramarital affair with an intern. Clinton led the charge to dismantle government assistance and to over-in-character millions of black people for nonviolent drug offenses, and the result has been devastating for black families for more than 20 years, and has been a major contributor to the disparities that black communities face. Bernie Sanders had a base that irritated me. Bernie Bros became a popular nickname to describe Bernie supporters who were white men, generally between the ages of 18 and 55, who essentially believed that Sanders was the second coming of Jesus. In all seriousness, Bernie Bros represented an image that has been plaguing the left for a long time, particularly as it relates to communities of color. Older white men insistent that class must always trump race, that racial discrimination and gender discrimination represent an outdated form of identity politics that would be resolved by improving the economy. Fairly or unfairly, much of Bernie's camp was seen as tone-deaf around issues of race, class, and gender, and this ultimately weakened any possibility of Sanders winning in the first election after a coalition diverse in race, class, and gender came together to elect the first black president of the United States. Looking at the field, there was little to be excited about. It was a drastic shift from the candidacy of Barack Obama, and while I have significant political disagreements with Obama and the policies of his administration, it's undeniable that there was considerable excitement among voters about both times he was elected, and yet, without that coalition behind them, pushing them further to the left while contending for power nationally, it seemed possible, but not inevitable, that a Republican candidate could win the White House. After all, if the left could not cohere behind an agenda for racial justice, an agenda against militarism, and an agenda to transform the economy with race, class, and gender at the center, what chance did we have to move the majority of the country to our side? Additionally, what should be the litmus test for whether or not we back a candidate in order to avoid a probable disaster? For many, the litmus test was in fact a purity test that assessed how closely each candidate matched our own politics, which of course was a losing strategy because each candidate, at least on the Democratic Party side, was at a minimum a fervent supporter of imperialism. Was it best to support the candidate who addressed the issues that you cared about, though imperfectly? Was it best to support no candidate at all because none were charismatic or left enough? What does it mean for the left to support a candidate? Should it be someone we would invite over to our homes for dinner? while much of the racial justice left remained ambivalent about an electoral strategy that could keep a deeply divisive and catastrophic Republican agenda from claiming victory, Republican candidate Donald Trump gained steam despite having little of substance to say on things like foreign policy, immigration reform, healthcare, and other issues important to millions of people. While many of us thought that he couldn't possibly win, that he was just a celebrity and wasn't running a serious campaign, the GOP got serious about winning the election and winning a majority in Congress, taking the Oval Office, controlling the majority of state houses in this country, and taking over the Supreme Court. An ambivalence on the left about electoral politics, the lack of a clear approach to electoral organizing and understanding politics not as we want them to be but instead understanding them and how they function, alongside purity tests that were simply impossible to meet, led to one of the most significant losses for the left in recent history. A rising tide of resistance, from the Occupy Wall Street efforts to the People's Climate March to Black Lives Matter, was met with an equal and opposite reaction in the form of a new kleptocratic, authoritarian regime that at the time of this writing has already done significant and, in some cases, irreversible damage. I don't recount this pattern to argue against a left that is critical of the two-party system, which is in fact deeply corrupt and designed to favor elites. The left is right to deplore the pageantry and commercialization of what claims to be a democracy that is the great equalizer between those who have and those who don't. Both candidates were deeply troubling, albeit in different ways. Donald Trump is a billionaire who has made a fortune on real estate, wage theft, racial discrimination, and terror. Hillary Clinton is a multimillionaire backed by the financial sector. It's important to know the histories, reputations, backgrounds, and positions of whoever is running for President of the United States, responsible for setting policies here and abroad, and yet a refusal to engage honestly with what was in front of us had and still has direct and devastating consequences. In the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders competed with Hillary Clinton for the party nomination. Sanders ran for the Democratic ticket, yet built his platform implicitly on populism that was at times deemed socialism. Admittedly, I was suspicious of populist platforms on the left and the right, particularly because populism in the United States tends towards conservatism. Sanders deployed a populist platform that predominantly appealed to white rural voters and lacked cogent and coherent analyses of race and gender. And yet, while it had a number of shortcomings, Bernie Bros being one of them, it was an opening for the radical left to engage with millions of people about what was possible, to draw millions more people into a movement for socialism, and an opening to bring socialism back into the mainstream from the periphery where it is currently positioned. When Donald Trump was declared the victor of the presidential election, the political terrain upon which revolutionaries had been fighting changed significantly. And yet, the assessment that the landscape has changed, and that those changes are not fleeting but are instead entrenched, far beyond the figure that represents those changes, and that as a result the task of revolutionaries in this period must be more carefully evaluated and undertaken, is not unfortunately a shared understanding amongst revolutionaries. As Revolution in the Air so poignantly reminds us, there is still time to learn from our mistakes to build a bigger and more effective left that challenges power on every front, and that builds the kind of power that can change the conditions of our communities. At the time of this writing, the United States government has been the aggressor in 2 preemptive military actions in Afghanistan and Syria. Despite campaign rhetoric from Trump himself about being the people's president and the White House being the people's house, in the 100 days after his inauguration, Trump signed no fewer than 66 executive orders, each one more treacherous than the last. Trump's executive orders have dismantled regulations and protections against the abuses of corporations in Wall Street, revoked critical protections that ensure fair pay and safe workplaces for workers, and banned immigrants from Sudan, Iran, Syria, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen. He has reorganized the executive branch and added tens of billions of dollars to the budget of the Department of Defense. Trump's orders direct the administration to repeal 2 regulations for each new regulation, reorganize the National Security Council and Homeland Security Council, rebuild the U.S. military, immediately deport any person living in the United States without documentation of citizenship, and build a wall between Mexico and the United States to stem the tide of illegal immigration. He has approved pipelines that create catastrophes for indigenous nations and other communities living in proximity to them, threatened to cut funding for sanctuary cities that do not comply with the orders of the federal government, reinstated the global gag rule designed to defund U.S. organizations abroad that counsel clients about abortion services, and signaled his intention to repeal the Affordable Care Act, offensively named Obamacare by the GOP. There isn't room to discuss all of the implications of these initial orders, nor is there adequate space to discuss the far-reaching impacts that these directives will have on millions of people. This is, after all, Max's book, and I can guarantee that there will be dozens if not hundreds of books written about the impacts of this administration. We can, however, use this book as a tool to begin charting a path towards what a vast, vibrant left can and should look like in the United States. We can take the truth serum contained in this book to take an extensive, honest, and courageous assessment of our relative power vis-a-vis the tremendous power that we are up against. We can take the lessons of today and of the recent and not-so-recent past, and take stock of what we have yet to create, and then get on to the important work of turning our vision into a reality, one step at a time. In this book, Max will tell you about the consequences of a young left which was relatively ambivalent about electoral politics and not sober enough in their assessment of the shifts happening in the balance of power, while it languished after the victories of ending the Vietnam War and those of the movements for civil and human rights. A new right was coalescing around them, in plain sight. The backlash from the victories that the left won, coupled with a tangible yet not large enough base committed to finishing what was started, meant serious consequences for Max's generation as well as the ones to follow, including ours. That's right, us, right here, right now, as a new and invigorated right coalesces and expands its influence directly in front of our eyes. What will we do? What can we learn here that can help us as a left transform ourselves so that we can transform the world together? We can and must make a commitment to learning new lessons and, more specifically, making new mistakes. I'm still struck by how many of the endeavors described in this book are things that I and my peers have done or experienced. Make no mistake, there will never be a successful internationalist left in the United States if we cannot learn from mistakes that have been plaguing us for decades, staying grounded in the actual material conditions while reaching for the sky. A reinvigorated left will have a clear vision of the world we strive to win, as well as a deep connection and resonance with wide swaths of people who share an interest in their personal and our collective freedom. This new and vibrant left will be grounded in theories drawn from the experiments we've embarked on and the tangible contributions we've made to our communities and to people's lives. It will actively work to nurture all of the diverse components needed for a successful movement. The reinvigorated left will be sharp in our assessments of the dialectic between social systems and economic systems. It will understand and engage with power. It will be rooted in a set of strategies aimed at taking power and transforming it. It will be diverse in its tactics and guided by winning tangible improvements in people's lives, and evaluated by the millions of people that it attracts and retains. The story of what the resistance will look like is still being written. But certainly it was divine intervention to return to this book at this political moment, to remind me of the terrain before us. We who are searching for strategies to build a new left will do so with many tendencies, working in coordination while still maintaining whatever independence we feel is necessary. We, people who are fighting to save our own lives, are fighting for there to be a better future than the one we inherited. We people who, as Bernice Johnson Reagan sang, believe in freedom, will not rest until it comes.